Hey guys, welcome back to Analyzing Horror. My name's Lauren, and today we'll be talking about one of my favorite movies of all time, 28 Days Later. So 28 days after a mysterious incurable virus that causes violent rage and aggression rapidly spreads across the UK, Jim and a handful of other survivors attempt to find sanctuary in the zombie apocalyptic world where hordes of infected are around every corner. So as I just mentioned, this is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I think it's also my favorite zombie apocalypse horror movie as well. I personally am a fast zombie kind of girl. I just find them so terrifying. I also really love the infected version of the zombie apocalypse story. Like some other favorites are Train to Busan, World War Z, and I also absolutely adore the video game The Last of Us. Granted, they're infected with a fungal parasite instead of a virus, but it still counts. There's also this immediacy about the virus that's so scary to me because you turn so quickly once you're bitten or come in contact with infected blood. Also, the infected themselves, just how they look and act and how freaking fast they are. Like once one hears or sees you, you're immediately in trouble. And they're so hard to fend off without getting a bite or some kind of injury. And I don't know, the entire concept coupled with the fall of civilization just scares the living hell out of me. That being said though, I do love slow zombies. My favorite is George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. I love the look of the zombies as well as Romero's zombie eating scenes are iconic. Anyway, but in addition to all of that, I love that 28 Days Later tackles many different concepts in addition to the virus. Like what human life is worth and what other humans are capable of doing to one another in this world. Like it's never just the infected to worry about in these stories. And I feel like that adds even more horror to the overall experience for me. And I just love that this movie touches on all of those points perfectly while being thought-provoking and genuinely terrifying at the same time, as well as having amazing cinematography and an incredible soundtrack and cast. And I just think this movie is perfect, and it's also in one of my favorite horror subgenres, so it's no wonder I love this movie so much. So fair warning, I'm going to be talking about the storyline and some spoilers, so if you haven't seen the movie yet, make sure to pause, go watch the movie, and come back afterwards. All right, let's get into my thoughts on 28 Days Later. I'd like to start off by talking about performances and some of my favorite characters. So first off, I absolutely loved Cillian Murphy as Jim. I thought he gave such a great performance, and I really loved his character. Like, I can't even imagine everything that his character goes through throughout this storyline. Like, suddenly waking up from a coma to the aftermath of an epidemic and having no idea what's going on. It must have been so scary. He's also absolutely incredible in that third act. Like, oh my god. It's definitely one of my favorite performances of his, and he's one of my favorite actors. I just love him so much. I also really liked Naomi Harris as Selena. I really like how she starts off like guarded, reserved, and hard ass at the beginning of the story, but she goes through some really great character development and she ends up softening to Jim as well as others later in the movie. I just really loved seeing her warming up to other characters throughout the storyline. I also absolutely loved Brendan Gleeson as Frank so much. Like, I grew up knowing him as Mad-Eye Moody, so it's always such a joy to see him on screen. Also, his relationship with his daughter Hannah is so sweet, and I just love that he's such a caring and loving man. I also really love that he kind of becomes the father figure for the group later on in the movie, and I just think it's so sweet and it just warms my heart. Lastly, I thought Christopher Eccleston was absolutely amazing as Major Henry West. He was such a dark and callous character. Like, oh my god. Like, every scene he was in gave me the chills, even when he was being friendly and welcoming, especially now with every rewatch because, you know, he has sinister ulterior motives. But even on my first watch, I just did not trust the guy, and for very good reason. I also know him as the Ninth Doctor from Doctor Who, so it's really cool getting to see him play an exact opposite character of the Doctor. Like, he's just a full-on villain in this movie, and he's so unsettling, and I just thought he gave an incredible performance. I also had to give a quick honorable mention to all of the infected actors. Like, they were so great. Like, all their movements, twitches, and unsettling noises were so terrifying, and they're genuinely so terrifying when they rapidly sprint towards you. Actually, I learned recently that they cast athletes as the infected because of how important the physicality and speed was for these infected beings. I just thought that was so cool, and it further emphasized the speed that they were coming at you. And I also thought they looked really great, like the makeup and effects on them as well as all of the gore. Like, they just looked and acted so great. Okay, let's move on to the storyline and some of my favorite scenes. So to start off, that opening scene where the activists are trying to do good by rescuing some chimps from a lab, but only end up being the inciting incident is so frustrating but sad at the same time. They just wanted to help these poor animals. but they end up accidentally creating this horrible epidemic that basically ends the world. I also really loved the mystery behind the virus. If you've been watching me for a while now, you might know that I'm the type of person that needs to know almost all of the answers to a movie, but I really loved how the movie gives you just enough. Not enough to overanalyze, but it's enough to understand that it's fast acting and it creates rage. And I just think that's perfect for the story that this movie is telling. I also love how quickly we get to 28 days later and suddenly we're with Jim waking up from his coma. Like I said earlier, I just cannot imagine how terrifying and confusing that must have been for Jim. Only to venture out of the hospital and discover an abandoned and desolate London. That scene where he's walking around in empty London is so eerie, chilling, haunting, and terrifying at the same time. Like the amount of emotional and mental digestion that Jim must be going through as he's looking around this wreckage, like I'd be freaking out, like just totally panicking. And I think that's one of the many reasons why I love this horror subgenre so much. It fully puts you in the character's shoes. And the thought of being in a zombie apocalypse world scares the ever-living shit out of me, so it's incredibly effective for me. Just the thought that you're never truly safe. Civilization has crumbled. Infected are around every corner. You don't know who you can trust. Like just the idea of it makes my heart race. Like, oh my god, it just is such a terrifying concept to me. I also really loved that empty walking around London scene because there was very little dialogue and the movie took its time and really let it fully sink in as Jim walks around the remnants of panic and fear. I was also impressed to learn recently that they actually shut down parts of London so that they could film these scenes. And I just thought that was so cool. And I really love when movies choose to film on location instead of just doing like a green screen backdrop. And just knowing that makes that scene all the more effective, knowing that it's real. They also shut down a large section of a major motorway for a driving scene so that everything was quiet and serene. And I bet it was really effective for the actors as well. And I would imagine it added to their performances during those scenes. Also, I had to mention the score in this scene. I love how the music starts off really quiet and barely audible, and it begins to get louder and louder until a booming guitar and drums melody is playing as Jim is walking around in abandoned London. And I just love this scene so much, and honestly, it's my favorite in the entire movie, largely because of this stunning main title song. But the score is so incredible throughout the entire movie. I really loved how it emphasized emotion and tension in every scene, and just made the movie as a whole so much more captivating. Also, absolutely loved the gorgeous cinematography in this movie. Also, there was some gorgeous cinematography. Every scene looked so gritty and unfiltered, and I really loved all the creative camera movements and angles. It felt like in every scene we got so many different camera shots. Aerial and low angle shots, long pan shots, as well as close-up shots, and there were also some incredibly breathtaking landscape shots. I also really loved all of the camera movements, as well as the occasional shaky cam during intense chase scenes, plus the infected point of view running shots were really cool. I also learned recently that at the time in 2002, this was one of the first mainstream movies that fully filmed digitally instead of on film, which is why it probably looks so gritty and unfiltered. And you also get like these glaring colors and sunlight shots. And I really love that they chose to film digitally because I really like how less polished but charmingly realistic the movie looks. All that plus the incredible soundtrack and amazing performances make this movie feel like more of an experience than anything. And I absolutely adore everything that went into making this movie feel so special. So as Jim tries to find civilization, he stumbles into an abandoned church and he discovers mountains of deceased people in the pews. He hesitantly calls out, "Hello?" And then we get our first scene with the infected. That priest and the other infected in that church were so creepy. Like again, like they're twitching in their movements, like the noises they make. It was so unsettling. And as the priest gets closer and closer, you can see their red eyes and they're just covered in gore. Like they were just so creepy and scary. Jim runs out of the church before the priest can get him, but a bunch of other infected from the church start chasing him down the street. And I've said this before, but they are so freaking fast. It's just so scary knowing how fast they're going, and they're just like gaining on Jim. And right as Jim is about to be overtaken by the infected, Mark and Selena come into the rescue with Molotov cocktails. That was such perfect timing, and I also really love Molotov cocktails as like a zombie apocalypse weapon. I just loved getting to see them used, and I also thought it was really cool that they blew up a gas station to eliminate those infected. That explosion was such an awesome scene. I also love the scene where Selena gets her monologue explaining the epidemic and the infected. I really love that scene because it was so captivating getting to hear the full devastation of a civilization. Jim insists that he needs to know what happened to his parents, so the group makes the short trip to his family home, only to sadly discover that they took matters into their own hands in their bedroom. That's such a sad scene, but I also really love when Mark tells his family tragedy story and tells Jim that he should be grateful that they went out peacefully at least. Then later that night, infected spot candlelight in the house and race forward and burst through the windows. I already mentioned this, but I really loved the infected point of view shots as they're running towards the window. It added so much more tension to that scene. Also, that scene is really quiet, so when they bash through that window, it's like a heart-stopping jump scare. And amongst the scuffle, Mark unfortunately gets bitten and Selena is forced to brutally take him out. She was so ruthless in that scene, like damn. But I get it. She later explains that it only takes 10 to 20 seconds to turn once you come in contact with infected blood. So the next day, Jim and Selena are looking for new shelter when they spot flashing lights on an apartment balcony a couple of floors up. So they make their way over to the building. But then a horde of infected show up and we get this crazy intense chase scene up these flights of stairs in the apartment building. It's at this point that we meet Frank, who's covered head to toe in protective gear, and he tells them which apartment they're in. And he and his daughter Hannah welcome them into their home. As I mentioned earlier, I just absolutely love the daddy-daughter duo between Frank and Hannah. I also just love Frank as a character and how excited he is to have company. He's so hopeful, but clearly very desperate too. He's quick to explain to Jim and Selena how they're severely low on water and other essentials, and how ultimately none of them can stay there for much longer. He then shares that he's been hearing a message on the radio, an announcement about a possible army base camp that's promising lodging and possibly answers to the infection. Selena protests at first, claiming that we could die while out there traveling to this location. But Hannah then chimes in that we would die by staying here too, so they might as well risk their lives trying to get to some form of sanctuary rather than just rot here and do nothing. So all four end up agreeing and begin on this journey together. So I love this section of the movie for so many reasons, but one of them is that there were so many intense infected scenes while they traveled. The one that sticks out the most for me was when their car got a flat tire while they were in a motorway tunnel, and as they were changing the tire, they could hear infected approaching. Like, oh my god, is this scene so intense and scary. Like, at first they had this giant wave of rats running past them away from something, and then they could hear the infected. Then you could see their shadows on the tunnel walls, and they're just getting closer and closer as the tire is being changed, and like, oh my god. Like, I'm fully on the edge of my seat every time I watch this scene. Another is when they stop on the road. Jim decides to explore a burger shop and comes across a deceased family, including an infant. He then gets ambushed by a very young infected boy and Jim has to take him out. Like, that scene is so heavy and it just further gives you a glimpse into this devastated, brutal, and bleak version of the world and what one sometimes has to do to survive. Although another reason why I love this section of the movie so much is that we get a ton of fun and bonding moments between Jim, Selena, Frank, and Hannah. I particularly love that grocery store scene and that they are able to just let themselves have a moment and happily shop, grab a bunch of food, and Frank grabbing like 5 bottles of expensive scotch. I just love that they got a little time to be carefree and let themselves have fun. I also really love how the four of them kind of create this chosen family dynamic. Like, they all trust and care for each other, and I just love it so much. That's another aspect about zombie apocalypse stories that I love so much, where a group of strangers kind of band together and become this chosen family for each other. I personally love this concept in any story regardless of genre. There's just so much heart in chosen family situations, and it just makes me so happy. And I love that it emphasizes that you don't have to be blood related to be family. Also, that scene where Jim is having a nightmare and Frank comes over to comfort him and just tells him it's just a dream, go back to sleep. And Jim groggily says, "Thanks, Dad," in his sleep. I honestly tear up a bit during this scene every time I rewatch this movie because they finally make it to the army base camp address that was on the radio. And as they're looking around, Frank sillily walks underneath the deceased infected with the bird picking at it, looks up, and a drop of blood plops right into his eye. And this is such a tragic scene because I loved Frank. I loved him so much as a character and he meant so much to everyone in the group, especially Hannah. Like, I can't imagine losing your dad in that way. And then that entire third act with the army soldiers and their mansion, holy hell. Christopher Eccleston as Major West was so welcoming but also deeply unsettling. And all of the other soldiers gave off intimidating and extremely creepy vibes. Plus, Jim, Selena, and Hannah were significantly outnumbered, and they also all had guns. So they quickly grew uneasy. And then one day, Major West explains to Jim that he promised them women. And oh my god, He goes on to explain that that's the entire reason for the radio message. Like, Jesus, what evil intentions these soldiers had. Jim rushes to Selena and Hannah and tries to get them all out in time, but they're ambushed by the soldiers. And their plan is to keep Selena and Hannah hostage and execute Jim. And this is yet another aspect about zombie apocalypse stories that I love so much because it terrifies me to no end. Humans being vile and evil to other humans amongst the apocalypse. Psychologically, I find that aspect of human nature morbidly fascinating. And it's just absolutely horrifying to consider what your fellow humans that you engage with on a day-to-day basis could be capable of if the social norms and rules were to vanish. And I just have to say, putting myself in Selena and Hannah's situation, like I could not imagine, like I would be absolutely and thoroughly horrified. So they attempt to execute Jim, but he manages to escape. And I just absolutely loved that final battle in the rain as Jim fights his way through the soldiers to save Selena and Hannah. Like he was so agile and quick moving, like he was just unstoppable. And I just loved this section of the movie so much. I also really loved how he took the soldiers out stealthily. I also really love how Jim released the infected soldier that the other soldiers had chained up on their property. And he ends up biting another soldier and they just wreak havoc through the mansion. Like I just really loved how Jim attacked from all angles. Like with stealth and unleashing the infected, it just created utter chaos in this scene. Then Jim is able to rescue his girls and they successfully escape the property. And then lastly, I absolutely loved that very final scene where Jim, Selena, and Hannah are living out of a very remote cottage in the countryside. They also sewed together large sheets to create the word hello on the land right next to their cottage, so that a plane flying by can see them. I just love it because we end on a hopeful note and we leave our characters happy. Also, we get some gorgeous airplane point of view shots of the English countryside and it's just breathtaking. And it's just the perfect ending to this movie. All right, those are my thoughts on 28 Days Later. I just think it's so perfect and I love everything about it. The performances and characters, the storyline, it has all my favorite zombie apocalypse concepts in the story, plus a gorgeous soundtrack and cinematography, as well as crazy, scary, infected, and gore. It also has such a bleak and devastating story, but there's also so much beauty in it, such as all of the character development bonds and connections, as well as that very hopeful ending. And like I just said, I think this movie is absolutely perfect and honestly a 2000s masterpiece. So what did you think about it? Do you have a favorite character or a favorite scene? Also, are you a fan of the faster infected zombies, or are you more of a fan of the traditional slower zombies? Let me know in the comments. Also, this is just a reminder that I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. So if you're interested in following me on those and you haven't already, the links are in my description box below. And as always, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so Black Phillip knows you'd like to live deliciously. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you again very soon in the next video. Bye!